Orson Welles took a lit candelabra and threw it at John Houseman, and the curtains caught on fire, and the back of Chasen's burnt down.
Before we even start our conversation, as you know, for some of you who've been here before, I like asking who's just seen Citizen Kane for the first time? You've seen one of the greatest films ever made. No, it's not embarrassing. It's really like, to see this. I remember seeing this, I think, on VCR in film studies class. So I saw it on a tiny screen, like on the box TVs. And it was, so to see the end of this was amazing. But Douglas, I'm so glad you're here tonight. I watched Mank. I remember seeing it in 2020 when it came out, and I watched it a couple of weeks ago. And, the tie to Citizen Kane. Let's talk about the first time you saw the film and what you remember about it.
I wondered why you asked me here tonight. I did not produce Social Network in it. I did not produce the movie. I appear in a little tiny role because David asked me to. But I thought you asked me here because we actually own Joseph Cotton's house that we live in Palm Springs. And I thought, that qualifies. I first saw Citizen Kane, and you've all just seen this, and you all applauded at the end. There are certain movies that if you watch them at home on television alone, and there are other movies that you must watch in the communal experience. All About Eve, if you're showing, is another one. If you're showing All About Eve, invite at least 5 people and have pizza, because it's a different thing. Citizen Kane, I was at NYU, and there was a place called the Bleecker Street Cinema. It was a rep house where 24 hours a day, they just showed all the great French movies, the great American movies over and over. And you would get your poster, you'd put it on the wall of your dormitory room, and you'd mark all the movies you wanted to see. And we'd see the Marx Brothers movies and W.C. Fields movies and Citizen Kane. That's where I first saw it.
So, we're still talking about this film. It's impacted so many filmmakers, including David Fincher, who, and of course Scorsese. Why do you think, this film has had this lasting impact? Like, what is it about what Orson Welles did that has made it last through the years?
It's a tough one because there's a lot of really good movies, and you're showing a bunch of them. Wizard of Oz, All About Eve, Bridge on the River Kwai. There's a lot of really good movies. It's hard to say what movie is the best, what has the most impact, until you sort of put the moment behind it, and until you put the stories that swirl around it behind it. Because Citizen Kane has everything that's not on the screen that lends to its mystique. It has a wunderkind who's about 12 years old who makes it. It has the clash of ego. And of course, it has the famous and untrue story that Pauline Kael wrote about and that we made a movie about. So I think that all the things swirling behind the scenes, everyone in this room, where the Bristol Farms is down the block over here. That is a central figure in this movie. You know that? That is where... Should I tell a story?
We love a story.
All right. And by the way... Huh?
It's Sunset and Fairfax.
No, it's over. Bristol Farms is right here, Beverly and Doheny.
Oh, that one. Sorry.
And incidentally, I will tell you that my wife, who's in the back here, she and I knew people who went to the weekends at this house. We knew Slim Keith and Claudette Colbert, who would tell us over dinner what those parties were like. So having seen the movie and been very young, you would then hear it brought to life for you. Anyway, over here at the Bristol Farms, it used to be a famous restaurant called Chasen's. Orson Welles came out here, the wunderkind, and RKO said, make whatever you want to make. And he said, I'm going to make Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And he got as far as screen tests. And he brought all the actors out from the acting company of his. He sat them down at dinner in the private dining room upstairs in the back of Chasen's and told them there's a change of plan. RKO thinks we're making Heart of Darkness, but I've got another movie we're going to make. And he had really been lusting after this idea of the American dream. I think it was called All American, the movie. And he was writing it and hitting walls. And John Houseman, who is a huge figure behind the scenes of all of this, those of you who have seen The Paper Chase know him from that performance, for which he won an Oscar, which does figure into the Kane story. John Houseman and he got into a huge fight in front of the actors over this dinner upstairs in the back room at Chasen's. And the fight was so bad, and they had a huge success with the Mercury Players on radio and on Broadway. This fight was enormous, and Orson Welles took a lit candelabra and threw it at John Houseman, and the curtains caught on fire, and the back of Chasen's burnt down. He said, "You brought these actors out here under false pretenses. How dare you?" And it erupted. John Houseman, who was Orson Welles' producing partner, got in his car, and he said, "I'm leaving." He got his car to drive back to his apartment on Manhattan, on 8th Street. And he stopped in Albuquerque, and he wrote Orson a letter. And it's this sort of really strange, almost kind of love letter that two men could write to each other who have an intense collaboration. And he writes this letter, which it's published, you can read it, and he keeps driving. About 4 or 5 days later, he ends up at his apartment on 8th Street, and as he's walking in the door, the way he tells the story, the phone is ringing, and it's Orson. He says, "Hello, it's Orson Welles." And Orson says, "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" And he says, "Orson, where are you?" And Orson said, "I'm in Chicago. We're refueling. I'll be there in a few hours." And Houseman agrees to dinner. And he sits down and he says, "The one thing I will not do is come back to you. I'm never coming back to you again." And then Orson, who could seduce really well, Orson seduces him, and he says, "Here's the thing." He says, "I've hit a problem with the script. There's only one man who can write it, and that's Herman Mankiewicz." And Houseman essentially says, "You know he's unmanageable. You know he's a drunk. You know he's unreliable. Yes, he's the best." And they all looked up to Herman Mankiewicz. They all looked up to him. You're going to be seeing The Wizard of Oz on this series, and you know the story. He wrote the first draft. And as David Fincher tells it, David puts it this way, that Herman Mankiewicz came up with the greatest special effect in history, which is the moment from The Wizard of Oz goes from sepia to color. And that was in Herman Mankiewicz's original script. That's one of his contributions that no one is even aware of. Anyway, Houseman gets seduced, and Orson says, "You don't come back. You're not going to be my partner. You're done. We're separated. But if you fly back with me now and wrangle Herman and oversee the writing of this script, that's well." And Houseman is intrigued, and he does it. They fly back, and the rest is told kind of accurately and kind of not accurately in our film. Our film, Mank, I don't know if any of you have seen it. He saw it. It's a sort of interesting film because it begins accepting the Pauline Kael famous book as true. And when I was in college and when we saw Citizen Kane, in the university bookstore, the Pauline Kael book was a big book that was in the front of the bookstore in piles because there were a lot of film students at NYU, and there it was. The Pauline Kael book, how it has its origins, how it creates the story, that there was a big fight over the authorship. There wasn't. Our movie depicts that. Our movie depicts an arbitration that never occurred until you think of it through the alcoholic eyes of Herman Mankiewicz, because he could turn on people, and he always turned on people closest to him, including one of his closest friends, William Randolph Hearst. Now, Orson, they do the film, and Orson talked a lot about the pained relationship they had, and he said there's someone. He was asked by a reporter, "Does anyone hate you?" And he said, "There's only one person who hates me," and he said that's Herman Mankiewicz, and I don't know why. John Houseman and Welles didn't really speak again after all of this, by the way. Houseman went on at his own career. He eventually founded the Juilliard School of Drama. As we know, he won an Oscar for The Paper Chase. Herman Mankiewicz had a famous brother who wrote and directed All About Eve, as we know. When Citizen Kane was being finished, here's where Orson's head actually was at. you may not remember, but an hour or so ago, 2 hours ago, you saw the opening credits. And Orson does not have single card directing credit. He shares it with the director of photography, Greg Toland. And he wrote about this and talked about this for the rest of his life, that Greg Toland co-directed the movie with him. And that's why he gave him the credit. So we hear a lot about Orson's ego. And then we hear a lot of other things that sort of contradict this. He was very generous with people as well. So he chooses, he has approval over the cards. He puts Greg Toland's name there on his card, and he does something else. They hand him the approvals, and it says screenplay by Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz. And Orson has a red crayon, and he takes it and he draws an arrow to put Herman's name above his. And that was really what happened. The story grew, and of course it became something that, because Herman was famous for self-destruction and betrayal, that he dined out on for years. He didn't live very long. He died of alcoholism. Now, everyone else in the story you've seen, the Hearst story, you all know Hearst eventually died broke. We may know that. Marion Davies, however, was wealthy and bailed him out again and again. He had given her so much real estate and jewelry over the years that she was wealthy, and she squirreled it all away. And she loved him. There was no question that she absolutely loved him, even though there was difference in their ages. She died of stomach cancer, married another man a few years later. He died in the house on the corner of Coldwater. Just when you turn by the firehouse up there, there's a big orange wall. That's where he died. You've seen it in The Godfather, the house with the horse's head. That's where Hearst died. John Houseman, on the night he's nominated for an Oscar for The Paper Chase, and he's terrific in it, if you remember that. And it spawned a lot of commercials saying we make money the old-fashioned way, we earn it. And he flew here for the Oscars, and he took as his date Herman Mankiewicz's widow, because Herman did not go to the Oscars for Citizen Kane, even though he won it. So his wife, Sarah, got to go to the Oscars eventually with John Houseman, who had produced Citizen Kane. And that's one story I wanted to tell you about.
What an amazing... Apparently, you have 3 stories, but isn't that an incredible story, an incredible history lesson that people like seeing?
Well, when next time you're buying a tomato at the Bristol Farms, you'll say, wow, this is what happened here.
But let's just talk a little bit, and then I want to hear the rest of these stories because these are amazing. But let's talk a little bit about how groundbreaking this was as far as storytelling visually, that opening, the use of flashbacks, the depth of field that we see in the cinematography. Like, talk about how groundbreaking it was.
There's a lot of Guild people here tonight, yes? Me too. You'll know exactly when I say this. There is something to be said about not knowing what you don't know. And at some point, anyone who's a professional has experienced that. Thank God I didn't know that then, because we'd never have done it. And I think that is before your eyes here. He didn't know. And so he's playing with things. And he's got Greg Toland next to him saying, yeah, okay, yeah, we can do that. And we've all worked, I hope, with a really good DP or a really good special effects person or someone who can say, I don't know. Then they come up with a way of doing it. And I think that's the first big thing. I'll tell you something else. At the beginning, this is a story told to me personally by Charlton Heston, but he told it to many people. He told the story of having lunch with Orson Welles at Ma Maison. And you know the story? Someone giggled, no, you. And it was, a lady comes up to Mr. Welles, a tourist lady. Oh, Mr. Welles, we just love your film, Citizen Kane. It's the best film of all time. And he says, thank you very much, dear lady, thank you very much. She said, there is one thing. You know what it is? And he says, what is it? What is it, dear lady, what is it? She says, well, we noticed that when he dies and says the word rosebud, there's no one else actually in the room with him. To which Welles responds, and don't you tell a living soul. that was a story that I'd heard from Chuck. as told to him.
Wow. Amazing. Wait, okay, so what's your other story? I'm going to let you tell.
No, those are just some ones that give you a backdrop, because you've watched two stories, really. You've watched the story of Hearst and Marion Davies and these people, and the fiction. Obviously, there was no Rosebud, and obviously there was no journalist. And then you've watched the story of a bunch of real actors and people in the real life. The Mankiewicz-Wells feud, the supposed Writers Guild arbitration that never occurred, the Hearst money and Marion Davies and their death, and then Houseman's visit to the Oscars, taking Mankiewicz's wife. I always think all of that is extremely romantic. And that was to answer your first question. What contributes? And not anyone knows these stories, but I think the mythology surrounding the film, this film, is as interesting as the actual film itself. You don't have a lot of wunderkinds who are very young, who come from the theater, who've never done this before, who bring a bunch of unknown actors and make this kind of movie. There are a lot of good movies made in those years, but this was a one-off. And isn't it interesting that it never did it again? It is one of those things that always strikes me, which is we all knew he was talented, and we all knew he could come up with things. Watch him on The Tonight Show even. He's terrific. But he never did it again, even though he tried. And of course, there is the story. He directs a film with Charlton Heston, a very, very good film. You know the film? I think it's called The Fugitive Kind. What's that? Touch of Evil. And the story, also told to me by Heston, was Chuck wanted to make this movie. It was a B movie at the particular studio, I want to say Universal. And they were going through the list of directors. And Heston says, you'll all appreciate this, Heston says, why not Orson Welles? Because we've cast him as the sheriff. To which the studio executive says, has he ever directed before? And that is another story. So I think the stories surrounding this and the personalities are as big as the movie.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many stories, and obviously Hearst did not like this film at all when it came out.
Well, there's an interesting thing there. He obviously didn't like it because it was, for whatever reasons, privacy. He felt betrayed because Mankiewicz was in his inner circle, as our film, as Mank shows. He was in there, and Mankiewicz was so self-destructive. He destroyed every strong, good relationship he had. There is another story, though, connected to this. There's a man named Michael Lindsay Hogg, who was a good director, and if you've ever seen Brideshead Revisited, you remember that. He directed it. And the rumor was for years and years and years, and he's still alive. He lives upstate New York. I'm in occasional touch with him. The rumor was always that he was Orson Welles' son. His mother was the actress Geraldine Fitzgerald, and they had met on, I want to say, Jane Eyre, that Orson was starring in. And there's this child. And the rumor was always that he was Orson's son, and it's most likely a true story. The resemblance is there in so many ways. And the story, I think Michael either told it to me on the telephone or it's one of his books. A house was rented on the Santa Monica Beach, a little bungalow house for Geraldine Fitzgerald to live in. She was here as a contract player working in films. And he was there as a little boy, maybe 5, 6 years old. And back at that time, you would let your kid go out and wander all day. And he wandered down the beach, and there was a door and a wall, a gate open. It was a hot day, and he went in, and there was a swimming pool with not anybody around. And this little boy takes off his clothes and goes swimming. And the way it was described, a very elegant lady came out there and said, "Who are you? You know you're not supposed to be here." And he got all nervous, and she said, "But would you like to come in for some lemonade?" And he remembers going in, and he went into what he described as a dining room. And there was an old man sitting at the end of the table who he made contact with and conversation with, who was very nice to him, who would have known who he was. And that man was William Randolph Hearst. fantastic stuff, isn't it?
Oh my
I love
gosh. See, people come to our screenings and stay for the Q&As and you get a history lesson.
Well, Hollywood anecdotes are forgotten stuff. They're really important, I think.
We talked about, winning the Soul Oscar. I mean, there are so many great lines in this screenplay. Like, people used to quote them. But do you have a favorite line from the film? Like,
From Citizen Kane?
from Citizen Kane, yeah.
Well, you've just all seen it, so I will mess it up. I do have a favorite line. And you think of people, sometimes they're filmmakers, who spend their own money making movies, or lots of money making movies. And sometimes they're wealthy, sometimes they're not. But you think of that line when he inherits the newspaper. And the guy says to him, Mr. Kane, we are losing, whatever the number is, this $100,000 a month. And he says something like, well, at that rate, sir, I'll be broke in 300 years. And whatever the lines were, that was always one of my favorite exchanges, because it just, and he gets under something. He gets under something about this reach for success. And I always think when you see the black smoke at the end, it all is nothingness. And he can't help but, remember, Orson had done a lot of plays. He had done a lot of Shakespeare. And he would have been very aware of all the symbolism along the way here.
Well, to that, let's talk about the symbolism of, Rosebud and the American dream and his story. Like, what happens in the film and the metaphor of it all, just not being successful and the isolation that comes with achieving the American dream.
It's a hard one for me to answer, only because I look at the work of Orson Welles, Citizen Kane, and then I think of the work of Arthur Miller. And if you'll notice that if you watch a film like, let's say, let's say On the Waterfront, they're almost, or Marty, there almost always is a priest character who comes in, usually Carl Malden. And the thing is that if you put religion in any of these movies, in Arthur Miller's writing or in Orson's stories, you don't have the story, because you need to build on the isolation that people feel, and maybe even the inaccessibility of the love you might have or other things. They must argue about the human condition, and they're not only arguing the human condition. I put it this way: the better the work, the more and the greater the talent, the less certain the artist writing it is about what they're saying. They may think they're certain, but they're having an argument with themselves. Do I want all of this money? Do I want San Simeon or Xanadu? Do I want the art? If I get it, maybe this is what will happen to me. And yet, some people have a lot of that, quite happy, as are some people who don't have it. I think there's always this internal argument. And Orson, there would be no doubt that he would be having an argument himself. There is a funny day. 1992, first weekend in December, Gary Oldman and I were supposed to fly to New York. He was going to do Saturday Night Live. Dracula had come out a week or two earlier, it was a big hit. And across the street from a friend of ours' house, Orson Welles' house was for sale. And they were having an open house. It was on Stanley in Hollywood. And so he said, let's go over and have a look. We got to go see. And, it's kind of sad. You go to the house, and you expect one sort of house, but there's shag carpeting, and there's a sort of jacuzzi in the attic, and it's all sort of, and because I feel certain he would have struggled for money at some point. He was doing those commercials. And there are many more commercials than the ones that come to your mind. If you go on YouTube, there's some really weird things. And you also have the commercials where he's getting drunker during every take when he's drinking the wine, and they have all of that on YouTube. But the thing about the house that was really, we were talking about this the other night when I said I was going to come here. And Gary reminded me, he had a screening room. But the screening room was the garage. And I don't mean a converted garage where you put some of these chairs. It was a garage with a garage door and a projector on a table hanging off, and a scrolled screen that had been rotted was hanging there. it was left. He had been long dead because he died in the mid-'80s. I was meant to have lunch with him. I was producing Broadway shows with very big older stars in those days. And his lawyer in New York, his then lawyer, said, have lunch with him. He died of a heart attack. Interesting, a few days earlier. Interesting was he and Houseman didn't speak all those years until one day Merv Griffin, who had a big popular TV show on the day, said, what about a reunion of these two? And you can find this on YouTube also. And you see Orson and Houseman, and they're very uncomfortable with each other. They're not interested in the reunion. It sounded like a good idea before we turned up. And right after that interview, Orson went home and dropped dead of a heart attack that night. So they had the reunion, wasn't so hot, and that was that. This is the they're interesting, big figures, and I think that's it. And the movie, you've just seen it all. It's pretty good, isn't it? So.
How many times have you seen it? I'm just curious.
Oh goodness. I've lost count. I mean, I've probably seen it more than 20 times in my life. And we're making Mank, of course. We all went back and we all were invited to screenings and we all saw it again and again. But it's one of those movies that it's a little bit like cold coffee at some point where you just say, I don't like cold coffee and I don't feel like it today. And there's other movies. For me, it's The Wizard of Oz. You tell me there's a Wizard of Oz. I say, when is that? What time is that? I want to hear the overture. I want to hear it start. You know, I want to remember all the stories about how it was made. I want to remember the genius of the production system of the day. I want to remember all the things about it. So, and I can't wait. This movie is a little bit harder because once you see it, it's hard to recapture that first experience that some of you had, unless it's been a long while. And those of you who have seen it for the first time tonight have the luxury of seeing it with other people on a screen in a dark room. Very different from putting on the VCR at night and watching it. Yeah.
Amazing. Douglas and his stories. Oh my God. So fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to Variety, of course, to Soho House and to Barco. Thank you all for coming out tonight.